Good evening and welcome. Take a moment to look at this scene before you. A family, a hearth, a table, and a meal. But this isn't just any family, any hearth, or any meal. We are looking back, far back, over 7 centuries, to a time we often romanticize with tales of knights, castles, and grand feasts. Tonight, however, we step beyond the velvet curtains of royalty and the armored gates of nobility. We descend, quite literally, to the very earth that sustained kingdoms, to the hands that toiled, and to the silent, often desperate struggles of those who formed the vast, unseen backbone of medieval society, the peasant. For many, the Middle Ages evoke images of chivalry and adventure. Yet, for the overwhelming majority, an estimated 85 to 90% of the population, life was a relentless cycle dictated by the sun, the seasons, and the unforgiving land. Their lives were not recorded in grand chronicles or epic poems. Their stories were etched into the calluses on their hands, the lines on their faces, and the very ground they tilled. Tonight, we try to understand one small yet profoundly significant part of their existence, the evening meal. Imagine a world without electricity, without refrigeration, without grocery stores bursting with endless choices. A world where the nearest mill might be a day's journey, and a bad harvest meant not just hardship, but often starvation. This was the reality for the medieval peasant. Their homes were humble, often constructed of wattle and daub, with thatched roofs that offered scant protection from the elements. Smoke from the central hearth, while providing warmth, also filled the single room, stinging eyes and lungs. Life was communal, often shared with livestock, and always tied to the land. The concept of a dinner as we know it today, a varied, balanced meal enjoyed in comfort, was a distant fantasy. For the peasant, dinner was survival. It was the culmination of a day spent in backbreaking labor, from dawn till dusk, enduring rain, sun, frost, and sometimes the crushing weight of feudal demands. Their bodies, constantly expending energy, craved sustenance, and yet sustenance was never guaranteed. This family you see before you embodies this struggle. Their faces, etched with concern and weariness, tell a story far more eloquent than any written record. The father, his hands rough from the plow or the axe, stares at the meager portions. The mother, her gaze fixed on her children, carries the quiet, ever-present burden of providing for them. And the children, their wide, fearful eyes reflect an understanding far beyond their years, the raw, primal fear of hunger, a fear that stalked every family and every medieval village. What did food even mean in this context? It certainly wasn't about culinary delight. It was about calories. It was about filling the stomach, about enduring until the next day and the day after that. Their diet was overwhelmingly cereal-based: bread, pottage, gruel. Meat was a rare luxury, often reserved for feast days or poached at great risk. Vegetables were whatever could be grown in their small garden plots: root vegetables, cabbages, onions. Dairy, like the milk we see here, was precious, a vital source of protein and fat, but often scarce, especially in winter or during times of drought. Consider the bread on their table. It's not the light, airy white bread we might enjoy today. This would have been a dark, coarse loaf, often made from rye, barley, or oats, sometimes mixed with peas or beans to stretch the flour. It would have been dense, hard, and often stale, but it was life. It was the backbone of every meal, and its absence meant certain suffering. The milk in the bowl, likely goat's or ewe's milk, perhaps diluted, offers some comfort, but it's a stark reminder of how little else there is. The candle, flickering precariously, casts long shadows, accentuating the gravity of the scene. It's not just illuminating their faces, it's a symbol of the fragile hope in their lives, a small light against the vast darkness of poverty and uncertainty.
Tonight, as we explore this scene, we'll delve deeper into the historical realities that shaped this family's dinner. We'll examine the peasants' daily grind and how it directly impacted their evening meal. We'll uncover the scarcity of sustenance, the climate, feudal obligations, and disease that contributed to the constant threat of hunger. We will look at the tools and techniques they used to prepare what little food they had, and how their meal differed drastically from that of the nobility. Our journey tonight is not just about understanding historical facts, it's about empathy. It's about looking into the eyes of this family and recognizing their humanity, their resilience, and their silent plea for a better tomorrow. It's about appreciating the immense privilege we often take for granted, the abundance and security of our own meals. So let us step into their world just for a moment and try to understand the profound significance of a simple, often insufficient evening meal for a peasant in the medieval era. It wasn't just food, it was life itself, and often it was a life teetering on the very edge of survival.
As the sun dipped below the horizon, the village fell into a profound, heavy silence, broken only by the distant baying of a wolf or the rustle of wind through the wheat fields. For this family, the darkness was not just a time for rest, it was an expensive period. Every second that candle burned, it consumed precious wax or tallow that took hours to produce or hard-earned pennies to buy. This dinner was eaten in a race against the fading light, a desperate ritual performed in the golden, flickering gloom of a cramped cottage. To truly understand the weight of this moment, we must look at the father's hands. Those hands have spent 14 hours gripping the handle of a heavy wooden plow, fighting against the stubborn, rocky soil of the Lord's domain. In the feudal system, he does not work for himself first. He owes his labor, his sweat, and the best of his strength to the local manor. Only after the Lord's fields are tended can he turn to his own small strip of land. This meal, this dry crust of bread and thin milk, is the only reward for a physical exertion that would break a modern athlete. His body is literally consuming itself, burning more calories than this table can possibly provide. Beside him, the mother's work has been no less grueling. While the history books focus on the plow, the medieval woman was the master of the hidden economy. She has spent her day hauling water from a distant well, grinding grain by hand between two heavy stones when the village mill was backed up, and tending to the toft, the small garden behind the house. If there are onions or leeks in the pottage tomorrow, it is because she guarded them from pests and frost with her own life. She is the one who measures the grain, knowing exactly how many days are left until the next harvest. When she looks at her children, she isn't just seeing their faces, she is calculating the depth of their hunger against the dwindling supply in the grain chest. Look closely at the bread again. In years of famine or the hungry gap, that desperate period in late spring when the old stores are gone and the new crops aren't ready, this bread might be adulterated. To make the flour last, they might mix it with ground acorns, sawdust, or even dirt. It was a common saying that a peasant's stomach was a graveyard of rough fiber. The very act of eating was often painful, wearing down their teeth to the gums by the time they reached 30. And then there is the fear. It is the uninvited guest at this table. In the medieval world, there was no social safety net. A single week of heavy rain during the harvest could mean that by midwinter, this table would be completely empty. A sudden tax from the king to fund a distant war or a localized plague among the cattle meant the difference between a meager life and a slow death. The children's silence isn't just out of respect for their father. It is the silence of those who have learned that crying does not bring more food. They eat slowly, trying to make the sensation of fullness last as long as possible, knowing that the morning will bring the same cold, the same work, and the same gnawing emptiness. This is the reality of the Middle Ages that the tapestries don't show.
Behind the grand cathedrals and the gilded manuscripts lies this room, a room filled with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and the quiet desperation of people who are one bad season away from vanishing. As we sit with them in this flickering light, we realize that for the medieval peasant, the greatest luxury wasn't gold or silk. It was the certainty of tomorrow's breakfast. An unspoken prayer hangs in the air with every swallow of milk. Let the crops grow. Let the Lord be merciful. Let us survive one more winter.
The golden glow of the hearth fire in a medieval peasant's cottage is not a sign of comfort, but a flickering barrier against a world of relentless hardship. To look at the table of a 14th century laborer is to witness the thin line between survival and catastrophe. This meal, often the only significant intake of calories after a day of brutal physical exertion, represents the culmination of back-breaking work, heavy feudal taxes, and a constant gamble with the elements. For the medieval peasant, the evening meal was dictated by the grain cycle. The dense, dark bread on the table was the primary source of life, yet it was often a source of pain. Made from coarse rye, barley, or maslin, a mixture of wheat and rye, this bread was frequently hard enough to break teeth and occasionally contaminated with ergot, a toxic fungus that thrived in damp harvests. Every loaf was a calculated risk. The milk or thin ale served alongside it was not a refreshing beverage, but a necessity for softening the stale crusts and providing the hydration needed to return to the fields at dawn. The expressions of the family reflect the hungry gap, that desperate period between late winter and early summer when the previous year's stores began to rot or run dry. During these months, the threat of famine was a physical presence in the room. The father's exhaustion is not merely tiredness, it is the result of burning 5,000 calories a day on a diet that provides barely half of that. His labor is not his own. He must plow the Lord's land before he can touch his own strip of soil, ensuring the nobility eats white bread while his children share a single bowl of pottage. The mother's role was one of constant management and preservation. She was the guardian of the larder, knowing exactly how many handfuls of dried peas or oats remained in the chest. In times of extreme scarcity, she faced the impossible task of stretching a few days' worth of grain to last a week. The garden herbs and wild leeks she gathered were the only defense against scurvy and malnutrition, turning a bland gruel into something edible. Beyond the physical hunger was the psychological weight of the feudal system. The wood for the fire, the water from the well, and even the right to grind the grain were all subject to the Lord's laws and fees. A peasant caught with a private hand mill or a poached rabbit from the forest faced severe punishment. This dinner was eaten under the shadow of the manor house, a reminder that they were part of a rigid hierarchy where their primary function was to produce wealth they would never enjoy. As the candle burns low, the reality of the medieval night sets in. There is no security in this room, only the resilience of a family that refuses to break. They eat in silence because there is nothing left to say. The struggle is understood by the ache in their joints and the emptiness in their bellies. This was the life of the vast majority of our ancestors, a cycle of toil, a bowl of grain, and the desperate hope that the sun would rise on a harvest that might finally be enough. The silence at the table is heavy with the knowledge that the coming winter will be longer than the grain in the sacks. In the medieval world, the calendar was not measured by months, but by the dwindling height of the food stores. As the family sits together, they are acutely aware that the season of starving time is approaching. This is the period when the cows go dry, the hens stop laying, and the root vegetables in the cellar begin to shrivel or turn to mush. Every bite taken tonight is a bite that will not be available in the freezing darkness of February. The physical environment of the meal adds to the burden. The smoke from the open hearth does not simply drift away, it lingers in the thatch,
blackening the rafters and stinging the eyes of the children. This smoke, however, is a grim necessity. It is the only thing keeping the dampness from rot and the insects from the few remaining pieces of salted meat hanging above. The floor, covered in old straw and herbs, hides the filth of daily life, but it cannot hide the cold that seeps up from the packed earth. The family huddles close to the table, not just for companionship, but to capture the fleeing warmth of the fire before they retreat to their shared beds. Community and charity, once the pillars of village life, are also strained during these times of scarcity. In a good year, a neighbor might share a scoop of flour or a pitcher of ale, but when the crops fail across the entire parish, every door is barred and every hearth becomes a fortress. The father knows that if his strength fails and he cannot complete his labor for the Lord, there is no one to step in. His family will be put off the land, losing their home and their identity, forced into the life of a wandering beggar, a fate often worse than death in the 14th century. The children look at the milk not as a treat, but as medicine. It is the only thing providing the calcium and fat their growing bones desperately need. Malnutrition in these years leads to stunted growth and a weakened immune system, leaving them vulnerable to the sweating sickness or the common ague that kills more peasants than the sword ever could. Their small hands, already stained with the dirt of the fields, where they pull weeds or chase birds from the grain, tremble slightly from the drop in temperature as the fire begins to die down. The psychological toll of this existence is a constant numbing fatigue. To live as a medieval peasant was to live in a state of perpetual anxiety. Would the rains come? Would the Lord's bailiff demand an extra tax this year? Would the local mill be closed for repairs when the grain was ready? There was no control over one's destiny. Life was a series of trials sent from heaven to be endured with a bowed head and a quiet tongue. The meal is a brief moment of pause in this war of attrition, a few minutes where the belly is not entirely empty and the wind is kept at bay by the thick stone walls. As the last crust is swallowed, the reality of the morning looms. Before the sun breaks the horizon, the cycle will begin again. The father will return to the mud, the mother to the fire, and the children to the endless tasks of the farmyard. They do not dream of riches or titles. They dream of a full stomach and a warm hearth. For them, the simple act of finishing this dinner and surviving until dawn is a victory. It is a testament to the incredible stubborn endurance of the human spirit in an age that offered almost nothing in return for a lifetime of work.
The transition from the dinner table to the rest of the evening marks the beginning of the dead hours. In these hours, the peasant family enters a state of semi-hibernation to conserve every possible spark of energy. The mother moves to the hearth to bank the fire, covering the glowing embers with ash to ensure they stay alive until morning. To let the fire go out was a disaster, a loss of the home's only source of life and heat that would require a grueling effort to restart. This ritual of banking the fire is the final act of the day, signaling that the house is now surrendered to the dark. For the children, the transition from the table to sleep is brief. There are no separate rooms, no private spaces. They lay down on pallets filled with straw or dried bracken, often huddling together with the family's small livestock if the winter is particularly harsh. The warmth of a sheep or a goat was often the only thing that kept a child from freezing during a great frost. This proximity to animals, while providing warmth, also brought the constant presence of parasites and filth, a reality that defined the physical existence of the lower classes for centuries. The father sits for a final moment in the gloom, his mind heavy with the custom of the manor. He is bound to this land by blood and law. He cannot leave without the Lord's permission. He cannot marry off his daughter without paying a fee. He cannot even sell his own calf without a tax. The very air he breathes feels owned by another.
This mental imprisonment is as exhausting as the physical labor. He calculates the tithes, the 10% of his harvest that must go to the church, and realizes that after the Lord takes his share and the church takes theirs, there is barely enough left to keep his family's ribs from showing. In the silence of the night, the sound of a rumbling stomach is a common lullaby. The pottage they ate earlier was mostly water and fiber, designed to create a temporary feeling of fullness that vanishes within hours. By midnight, the gnawing hunger returns. This chronic malnutrition leads to a peculiar state of mind, a mixture of lethargy and vivid, hunger-driven dreams. They dream of the land of Cockaigne, a mythical medieval utopia where the rivers ran with wine, the houses were made of cake, and roasted pigs wandered the streets with knives in their backs, inviting people to eat. For a peasant, heaven was not a place of golden harps, but a place of infinite food. As the temperature drops inside the cottage, the family's breathing synchronizes in the darkness. They're a single unit of survival. If one falls ill, the whole family risks collapse. If the father's back gives out, the fields go untended. If the mother dies in childbirth, a common tragedy, the household's management fails. Every night is a period of mourning for the strength they lost during the day, and a fearful preparation for the strength they must find tomorrow. The medieval night is not empty, it is filled with the spiritual fears of the age. They believe the darkness is populated by demons, fairies, and the restless dead. Their only protection is a whispered prayer and the sign of the cross, a spiritual armor against a world they cannot control. The physical hunger and the spiritual dread bleed into one another, creating a life where the supernatural is as real as the mud on their boots. When the first gray light of dawn finally touches the thatched roof, it brings no relief, only the resumption of the struggle. The embers are uncovered, the thin gruel is set to boil, and the cycle of the medieval peasant begins once more. They rise not because they are rested, but because the land demands it. Their existence is a monument to human persistence, 1,000 years of mothers, fathers, and children who ate their dry bread in the dark so that the flame of humanity would not go out.
The morning air inside the cottage is thick with the scent of damp wool and cold ash. As the family rouses themselves, it is important to understand that their survival was not just a matter of hard work, but a complex navigation of medieval science and social engineering. One of the most fascinating aspects of their lives was their relationship with water and ale. In an age where standing water was often a death sentence due to parasites, the peasant family relied on small ale. This was a low-alcohol, fermented brew that provided essential B vitamins and, more importantly, was boiled during the brewing process, making it safer than the local well. A typical peasant might consume several liters of this thick, cloudy liquid a day. It was not a luxury for intoxication, but a vital source of liquid bread that kept them upright during the harvest. As the father prepares to head to the fields, he puts on his boots, if he is lucky enough to own them. Interestingly, shoes in this period were often turn shoes, made inside out and then flipped, with no distinction between left and right. They wore down quickly on the rocky soil, and many peasants spent their entire lives walking barefoot or in simple wooden clogs. This physical connection to the earth was literal. The soil was their master, their provider, and eventually their grave. Let's look deeper into the pottage we mentioned earlier, as it reveals much about the medieval economy. While we often think of the Middle Ages as a time of meat eating, for the peasant, meat was a status symbol they rarely touched. Instead, they relied on white meats, a medieval term that actually referred to dairy products like cheese, butter, and milk. If a family owned a cow, that cow was the most precious member of the household, often living under the same roof,
The veal or beef we see in movies was almost non-existent for them. A cow was far more valuable alive for its milk than dead for its meat. In fact, killing a healthy cow was often seen as the sign of absolute desperation, a final act before a family succumbed to starvation. Another intriguing detail of their daily life was the concept of time. The medieval peasant did not live by the clock, but by canonical hours and the church bell. Their day was divided into shifts like matins, prime, and vespers. However, they also practiced something modern science is only now rediscovering: biphasic sleep. It was common for medieval people to have a first sleep shortly after the sun went down, wake up for an hour or two in the middle of the night to pray, talk, or tend to the fire, and then fall into a second sleep until dawn. This midnight vigil was often the only time a husband and wife had to speak in private, away from the ears of their children or the demands of the Lord. The forest that bordered their village was a place of mystery and strict law. We often imagine peasants hunting deer, but the forest laws were brutal. A peasant caught killing a deer in the king's forest could be blinded or hanged. Even vert, the green wood of the trees, was protected. They were allowed only by hook or crook, meaning they could only take the dead branches they could reach with a shepherd's crook or a harvester's hook. This led to a constant, quiet war between the village and the foresters, where wood was smuggled like gold to keep the evening fire burning. Furthermore, the very salt on their table was a precious commodity. Salt was the only way to preserve food for the winter. Without it, meat would rot and vegetables would wither. It was so valuable that it was often used as a form of currency. A peasant family would spend a significant portion of their meager income just on enough salt to keep a pig's carcass from spoiling. If the salt supply failed, the winter would bring the long hunger, a period where the body begins to consume its own muscle to stay alive. The psychological landscape of the medieval peasant was also shaped by the great chain of being. They truly believed that their position in life was ordained by God. To rebel against the Lord was to rebel against the heavens. This belief provided a strange sense of stability, but also a crushing weight of inevitability. They did not expect their children's lives to be better than their own. They only hoped they would be the same. Progress was not a medieval concept. Endurance was. As we watched the mother stir the morning gruel, we should note the messes. In the medieval house, people didn't always have individual plates. They ate from trenchers, thick slabs of stale 4-day-old bread that served as a bowl. At the end of the meal, the juice-soaked bread was either eaten by the hungriest family member or given to the dogs. This was the original zero-waste kitchen, born not from environmentalism, but from the raw necessity of making every crumb count. The evening meal we saw was just one frame in a lifelong movie of struggle. Between the threat of the Black Death, which wiped out entire villages in a single season, and the Little Ice Age that shortened growing seasons, the medieval peasant was a survivor of the highest order. They were the masters of making much out of nothing, of finding hope in a bowl of gray peas, and of maintaining a family bond in a world that treated them as little more than livestock with souls. Their story is not of glory, but of the quiet, stubborn rhythm of the seasons. It is the story of the bread, the ale, the salt, and the soil. And as the father finally steps out into the morning mist, the cycle begins anew, a cycle that would remain unchanged for nearly 500 years, until the wheels of the Industrial Revolution finally turned the peasant into a worker and the cottage into a memory.
Beyond the daily grind, the medieval peasant's life was punctuated by rare moments of relative abundance, known as the feast days. These were the only times the family's table would transform, and understanding these breaks in the cycle is essential to grasping their psychological resilience. On days like Michaelmas, Christmas, or the local Saint's Day, the rigid social hierarchy loosened just enough for a glimpse of luxury. On these occasions, the lord of the manor was often expected to provide a boon loaf, a bread made of finer wheat, and perhaps a piece of salted beef or a shared pig. During these festivals, the family might finally taste frumenty, a celebratory dish made of boiled cracked wheat mixed with milk, honey, and if they were incredibly fortunate, a pinch of cinnamon or saffron traded from a traveling merchant. These spices were worth more than their weight in gold, arriving via the Silk Road from lands the peasants could only imagine as myths. To a person who spent 360 days a year eating gray pottage, the explosion of flavor from a single clove or a bit of honey was nothing short of a religious experience. It provided the mental fuel to endure the next 6 months of bland, repetitive misery. However, the shadow of the 14th century brought a transformation that changed their dinner tables forever: the Black Death. While we view the plague as a pure catastrophe, it created a bizarre golden age for the surviving peasants. With nearly half the population gone, labor became incredibly valuable. For the first time, the father in our scene could demand higher wages or lower rents. This power of the peasant shifted the diet significantly. Historians note that after the plague, the consumption of meat and quality ale rose sharply. The peasant was no longer content with horse bread made of beans and bran. They demanded man's bread made of wheat. This shift led to the sumptuary laws, where the nobility, terrified by the rising status of the lower classes, actually passed laws to forbid peasants from eating certain expensive foods or wearing certain colors. It is a profound historical irony. The elite were so threatened by a peasant with a full stomach and a piece of bacon that they had to make hunger a legal requirement. This tension between the working belly and the ruling crown defined the late medieval period, leading to massive social upheavals like the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Another fascinating yet grim detail was the Malthusian trap they lived within. The population would grow until it outstripped the food supply, leading to the Great Famine. During the years of 1315 to 1317, the rain simply did not stop. The hay could not be dried, the grain could not be harvested, and the salt, the only preservative, could not be produced because the seawater wouldn't evaporate. In those dark years, the dinner we see on the table would have vanished entirely. Chronicles from the time speak of people eating dogs, cats, and even the thatch from their own roofs. The fear we see in the children's eyes in our image is the inherited trauma of those black years. The gender roles during these evening hours also held deep significance. While the father was the breadwinner in the literal sense of plowing the field, the mother was the alewife or the brewster. In many villages, women ran the local brewing industry from their own kitchens. If the mother in our story was a skilled brewer, her small ale might be the family's primary source of extra income. This allowed them to occasionally buy a metal cooking pot or a sturdier wool cloak. The dinner table was not just a place for eating, it was the boardroom where the family's survival strategy was negotiated every single night. As the night truly takes hold and the family settled into their second sleep, we must acknowledge their incredible biological durability. Modern humans with our antibiotics and sanitized environments would likely perish within weeks of living their life. Their immune systems were forged in the fire of constant exposure to the elements and communal living. They were a climax species of the human race, perfectly adapted to a world of scarcity, high physical demand, and social restriction. In conclusion, the story of the medieval peasant's dinner is the story of the foundation of Western civilization. Every cathedral, every castle, and every university of the Middle Ages was paid for by the surplus of the grain these people grew and the calories they denied themselves. They were the silent engine of history. When we look at the dry bread and the simple bowl of milk, we are not looking at poverty. We are looking at the ultimate victory of life
over a world that tried every day to extinguish it. Their legacy is not in gold or stone, but in the very fact that we are here today to tell their story.
To further broaden our understanding of this world, we must look beyond the village borders to the geographical and seasonal variations that defined the medieval gastronomic map. While the core of the peasant diet was grain, the flavor of survival changed drastically depending on where the cottage stood. In the north, such as the Scandinavian regions or the Scottish Highlands, the evening meal was a battle against a much shorter growing season. Here, wheat was a fantasy. Instead, the family relied on oats and barley. They ate bannocks, dense, flat cakes cooked on a stone, and relied heavily on preserved fish. For a northern peasant, the scent of dinner was often the pungent smell of dried cod or salted herring, a vital source of vitamin D in a land where the sun vanished for months. Their resilience was built on the sea as much as the soil. Contrast this with the Mediterranean peasant in Italy or southern France. Their table, while still poor, looked remarkably different. Instead of the thick animal fats and butter of the north, they relied on olive oil. Their pottage was brightened with chickpeas, lentils, and wild greens like dandelion or chicory. They had access to vinegar, which acted as a primitive preservative and a way to mask the taste of tainted water. While a northern peasant might shiver in a damp wooden hut, the southern peasant contended with heat and dust, their greatest fear being a drought that would wither the grapevines and olive groves before the tithe was collected. There is also the fascinating ecclesiastical calendar to consider, which governed every bite of food through the concept of fast days. The Catholic Church dictated that for nearly 1/3 of the year, including every Friday, Saturday, and the long weeks of Lent, meat and dairy were strictly forbidden. For our family in the image, this meant that even if they had a bit of bacon or a drop of milk, it was a sin to touch it. During Lent, the hungry gap became a spiritual trial. They were forced to eat Lenten pottage, which was little more than water, onions, and perhaps a few dried peas. Imagine the psychological strain of having food in the larder, but being forbidden by the fear of eternal damnation from feeding it to your crying children. We must also mention the architecture of the stomach. Because the medieval peasant had no forks, which were seen as an effeminate or even a devilish luxury from the East until much later, eating was a tactile, sensory experience. They ate with their fingers and a whelk shell or a wooden spoon. This meant that the etiquette of the peasant table was built on communal sharing. Breaking bread was not just a metaphor, it was a physical necessity. They shared a single bowl, a single cup, and a single loaf. This communal eating reinforced the village bond. You knew who was healthy, who was failing, and who was taking more than their share. As we look deeper into the health and medicine of the dinner table, we find the theory of the four humors. Even the lowliest peasant had a basic understanding that food affected their temperament. They believed that root vegetables growing in the cold earth were melancholic and heavy, suitable only for the lower classes. High-status foods like birds, which flew in the light air, were reserved for the nobility. This meant that the peasant was literally mapped to the soil by the very medical science of their time. They were told that their bodies were literally made of coarser stuff, and their diet of dark bread and onions was natural for their station in life. The night is now deep, and as the family sleeps, the invisible economy of the medieval village continues to churn. Outside the cottage, the gleaning laws allow the poorest of the poor, the widows and orphans, to pick up the stray grains dropped during the harvest. This was the social safety net of the medieval ages, a form of communal welfare, where the village ensured that even those without land had a few handfuls of grain for their evening pottage. This concludes the development of our journey. We have seen that the medieval peasant's dinner was not an isolated event, but a thread in a massive, complex tapestry of law, religion, biology, and geography. It was a life of quiet desperation, yes, but also one of incredible ingenuity.
They were the ultimate recyclers, the ultimate survivors, and the foundation upon which the modern world was built. When we turn off the light tonight and look at our own kitchens, filled with food from across the globe, we should remember the flickering candle and the dry crust of the 14th century. We are the descendants of those who didn't give up. We are the legacy of the pottage and the plow. As the night reaches its coldest point, we must look at the biological resistance of the medieval peasant. We often wonder how they survived winters without modern insulation or heating. The secret lay in their metabolic adaptation and the thermal architecture of their clothing. The family at the table is wrapped in heavy, unwashed wool, a material that retains heat even when damp. The lanolin, the natural oil in the wool, provided a primitive waterproof layer. For them, smell was a forgotten sense. The stench of wood smoke, sweat, and animal musk was simply the smell of safety. To be clean was to be cold, and in the 14th century, cold was a killer. Let us explore a deeper, often overlooked fact, the medieval garden or the arbor. While the father was out in the open fields, the area immediately surrounding the cottage was the woman's domain. Here she grew pot herbs such as borage, hyssop, and mallow. These weren't just for flavor, they were the family's pharmacy. In a world without aspirin, a tea of willow bark or a poultice of comfrey was the only relief for the father's aching joints. The evening meal was often infused with these medicinal plants, turning their dinner into a ritual of healing. They were the original organic farmers out of necessity, not choice, utilizing every weed and leaf the earth provided. There is also the matter of vassalage and the miller. We've touched on the tax, but the social dynamic at the mill was a microcosm of medieval life. The miller was often the most hated man in the village, suspected of thumbing the scales or mixing grit into the flour to increase its weight. When the peasant brought his grain back home and the family sat down to eat, a significant portion of their conversation, if they had the energy to speak, would be about these local injustices. The dinner table was the birthplace of class consciousness. It was here, over thin soup and hard bread, that the seeds of future revolutions were sown. They realized that while they starved, the tithe barns of the church were overflowing with their grain. Another intriguing detail is the seasonal shift in daylight. In the winter, the evening meal happened as early as 4 p.m. After that, the family entered a state of social darkness. Without the ability to read or the light to work, they became masters of the oral tradition. This is where folk tales, ghost stories, and legends of Robin Hood were passed down. Their dinner table was their theater. Stories of a hero who stole from the rich to feed the poor weren't just entertainment, they were a form of psychological survival. It allowed them to imagine a world where the scales were balanced, even if their own bowls were empty. Furthermore, we must consider the ecological impact of their diet. The medieval peasant was a vital part of a closed-loop ecosystem. The waste from their meal went to the pigs. The pigs provided manure for the garden. The garden provided the herbs for the pottage. There was no trash in the medieval world. Everything from the bones of a rare chicken to the ash from the fire was repurposed. The ash was used to make lye for washing or spread on the fields to sweeten the soil. This total integration with their environment meant that the peasant was more at one with the earth than any modern environmentalist could dream of being. As the pre-dawn light begins to turn the black sky to a bruised purple, we see the daily resurrection. Every morning they woke up was a miracle of biology. They had survived the night, the demons, the cold, and the hunger. They would take the leftovers of the pottage, if there were any, and eat them cold before heading out. This was breakfast, or the breaking of the fast. It wasn't a separate meal with eggs and bacon. It was simply a continuation of the struggle. The legacy of this peasant family is written in our DNA. Their ability to survive on low-protein, high-fiber diets, their resistance to local pathogens, and their incredible psychological grit are the reasons we exist today. When we look at the image of the family at the table, we shouldn't just see poverty. we should see a high-functioning, specialized group of survivors who managed to build a world out of mud and grain. They were the silent majority, the forgotten millions who, through their simple act of eating dinner and surviving the night, ensured that the story of humanity would continue into the light of the modern age. The final embers of the fire settle into a dull, pulsing red, and the narrative of the medieval peasant's dinner reaches its inevitable conclusion. This journey through their evening meal has been more than a study of food. It has been a study of the human spirit refusing to be extinguished by the weight of an unforgiving world. As the family finally surrenders to sleep, the candle flickers one last time and dies out. The darkness that follows is absolute, a silence that modern people, surrounded by the hum of technology, can hardly fathom. In this stillness, the development phase of our story concludes, and we arrive at the final resolution. The legacy of this dinner is found in the survival of the commoner. History often focuses on the rise and fall of empires, the signing of treaties, and the deaths of kings, but the true story of humanity was written in rooms like this one. For every knight who fell in battle, there were 1,000 peasants who fought a